let me start high level with this point of narrative. The image that Jack Waters had was one of Schumpeterian disruption. Jack's response to some of what Commissioner Chopra said is, oh, Sears was a great dominant platform in its day, and it's gone. The history of the railroads has an interesting set of challenges where we look at different abuses, including the famous issues around Standard Oil, which actually involve Standard Oil using the railroads to its strategic advantage, begging the question of what we learn from that history. And part of what Commissioner Chopra just underscored is 20 years ago, a lot of the cyber law scholarship that was then called was incredibly optimistic about disintermediation and democratization. And it was viewed as the information age more in terms of nirvana, but today dystopian fears like Minority Report, some of the artificial intelligence concerns that Rohit mentioned, are actually on the tip of people's tongues. So my question to each of you, as you think about these dueling narratives, how do you reconcile what truths lay within each of them? One is a great narrative of Schumpeterian creative destruction, disintermediation, innovation, benefits to consumers, benefits to democracy. The other is more fears of dominant platforms that control our lives in ways we may not even know. Balan, you've lived through this information revolution. How do you come to terms with those dueling narratives?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on the panel. I think you have to look at who the winners and losers are, at least from where we stand today. And if you look at the constituents here, you've got the governments, you've got businesses, and you've got end users. One can argue governments for the longest time, depending on where they sit, either like to hate social networks. For the most part, if you were in the Middle East in the last 10 years, you hated social networks. In the United States in the last 10 years, until about 2 years ago, you loved social networks if you were a government, right? So you've got that one entity. So governments, I think, today universally view social networks as a threat to themselves, as well as a loss of revenue, because these networks, and not just social networks, but the internet platforms in general, have taken taxation from productive tax-paying businesses into non-tax-paying verticals. So that's one entity. Second, businesses. Businesses in general view all these platforms as dangerous because they've monopolized payment systems, they've monopolized data, they've monopolized inventory, ad inventory, they've monopolized technology. The tech to do artificial intelligence requires tremendous amount of capital and scale. And they've also monopolized capital access. I mean, you're talking about close to $1 trillion of valuations for each one of these companies. It's just sucked out, capital from a lot of other businesses. So that's another constituent. The third one is the users. The users see this as all great. I got free stuff. It has never been this good, where I can just type in something, I get answers. If I want to buy something, it's just a click. It's the best time for users. However, it's a short-lived best time, because I think users are starting to realize the dangers of having their data being exposed. So that's how I see it in general.
Patty, you are our expert on narrative as well as on railroads and that history. What lessons do you learn, or what questions do you ask?
I shall just engage in wild acts of oversimplification in the next few minutes here. I'm going to just, next minute really. So I'm thinking, this is a little like time travel. I thought it would be interesting to visit the late 19th century, and now I'm kind of here because in westward expansion, there were many enterprises, many of them very heavily supported by the federal government, and there was a general not universal, but some society-wide cheering. Oh, heavens, we've got railroads, we've got mines, we've got logging, we've got freighting, we've got freighting and stagecoaches that spur off the railroads. Oh, my goodness, look at all this access that we had. So we had that, and so there's a lot of cheering, and then pretty fast there was the, what we got here. And the life cycle of companies is really interesting. Most Western towns started very strongly with that. This town has been born. This town is growing. Not really saying at some point this town will be old, in old age and will perish. I mean, it is an interesting problem, life cycles. So, but I do, and I don't want to say that life cycles should govern our thinking about institutions, but it is a pattern in Western American history to see companies that emerge with vitality and innovation that turn defensive and prickly and power hugging in ways that happen pretty fast from the innovation era. And so the fact that it seemed like the tech people were quite young for a while, and now they seem to be a little bit more middle-aged, it's kind of an interesting, well, there it is happening in the leadership of that. So I guess I would say we are in, not in any way a reenactment of the late 19th century, but just as the period of expansion into the West in the mid-19th century was exhilarating and seemed to fall under the category progress, pretty soon the reckoning came. People started talking about a timber famine, that we would have taken the most forested continent, extraordinary resources, and left it with a lacking supply of timber. So all kinds of concerns. We have had mines. We have left abandoned mines. So that reckoning of what have we done and what, well, I mean, this is where your talk is so, right, okay, so now we have these consequences. We had benefits. There's no denying the benefits. But now we have the what will be the intelligent regulation and the enforcement process that can help us with that reckoning. Not to erase the benefits in the least, but to reckon with that. And I guess I would say there's a lot more options than there might seem. One of the great things about history is that you do see passed up alternatives. And so you see things like that I don't think are in people's stereotypes of the West. The first laws to protect the bison, to try to preserve the buffalo, those were in the 1870s. One bill passed in 1874. It's way out of the time period, you'd think. So I think we can see our predecessors as saying, take it on. Take it on, and I'll just use this as a teaser, maybe use it as an occasion to really do some bedrock thinking about federalism and the allocation of authority between state, federal, and local, and also think about the extraordinary power of public relations and what they call in the oil and gas industry the social license to operate, to promote better self-regulation and better best practices and so on. That is a backstory of the reaction, I'm actually going to end here, the reaction and reckoning with the costs and injuries and troubles of westward expansion. The outcome of that was a lot of backstage maneuvering hidden in archives. The progressives give public speeches in the late 19th century and the early 20th century about regulating industry and pushing industry back and making sure it does not harm citizens. In the archives, there's a lot of correspondence between company leaders and those progressive activists, with the company leaders basically saying, you're going to have to help us. Our reputations are not good, and really our only hope is if you will help us restore our credibility and trust. And again, that's not out in the public record very much, but it is there in the archives. So I guess I'm not saying history repeats itself, because it does not. Every situation is very different, but history leaves Hansel and Gretel-like crumbs of inspiration behind it, of alternatives not taken, of efforts that were taken but may or may not be in our minds. Oh, I'm stopping, for heaven's sake. You can't stop a historian from just chattering on.
History may not repeat itself, but it's said it often rhymes.
Yes, and it often gets over communicated in these situations. So that was a TMI moment, and I'll control myself here. I'm under control.
Building off of Balin and Patty's point, let me ask you, because we've now had 3 sets of governmental institutions mentioned. Internationally, both other countries, international coordination, nationally, and then state governments. You've had a perspective to see it all of them. How do you see, from a governmental challenge, how do we take this narrative on board, things like the FTC studies, and navigate policy in this fast-moving area?
That was really cool.
Don't encourage me. Don't encourage me.
That's the idea, Patty, actually.
I didn't hear it.
It was really cool. And I love the idea that history rhymes. I think that's absolutely right. Just to go back to the original framing of your question of the 2 narratives, I mean, you know that we're all thinking it's both, right? We all think that it is actually both. It is both the creative destruction, and at the same time, it's also a perpetual fear of what these new sort of overarching technologies will do in our lives and how they will impact and reshape our lives. And I think that's where policy fits in, is basically to figure out how those narratives will affect each other and which of those narratives need to be sort of the dominant at which time, et cetera. And just as Patty had mentioned, I think that's what policymakers do, and it's ever, we're ever balancing, or they are ever, because I have no idea what I am at this point, they are ever balancing between those two sort of narratives. And the same solution does not work constantly throughout you can't always impose structural remedies, you can't always impose behavioral remedies, and you can't always count on one thing setting up for the next. In this instance, you have situations where the kinds, I think, Rohit, your keynote was very helpful in sort of teeing up the differences in the way, you just beautifully sort of set up the changes in the way we deal with data and the amounts of data that we're swimming in at this point, and why that changes the way companies work, and why that changes the way companies compete, and why that changes the way companies are able to monetize what they do. And in some instances, we may think large can actually be helpful, right? Large can actually allow for certain things. For example, I don't know that it necessarily made sense for a smaller company to go into content, but then you have folks like Amazon and Netflix who are finding ways to start really beginning to compete in that and make a significant dent in some of those particular sort of strategies. So I think as when we're in a situation where we have so many more, I think, large competitors, large industries that sort of that need a massive amounts of scale to actually really compete and actually be efficient in the market, you do need places like federal governments and global governments to sort of step in and sort of be the primary regulators. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for the more on-the-ground sort of type of work that needs to happen. Certainly, as you're pointing out, there are roles for state governments, and the roles on federalism, I think, will go ever back and forth as we try to figure out what the balance is. That's a pretty general answer at this point, but I guess as we get more into specifics, we can start speaking about where more of these choices have to be made.
Wrote on these narratives, how do you think about it?
Well, I agree with Grace that there's not an answer. There's an importance of thinking about the prism, the whole thing. I mean, the one thing that I didn't speak about, but I feel very deeply, is that the way in which we are advancing, particularly with the aggregation of data, what we're seeing, I think, particularly in China, is a very different vision of the use of data and the aggregation of data in ways that I think are really just completely different than we would want our society to progress toward. And I think there's a question then of can we really solve this through economic models and with technicians, or are we going to have to consider some things that are really hard to measure? I mean, I think in the last panel, this question of wanting to know what the concerns are and what the evidence is, but then raising, what if it's not measurable? Does that mean it's zero? And I think that's the challenge that we have to face, that this is going to be decided not just by a calculation, but also by our values too.
I want to go back to Balan, because you, in your describing what's happened, talked about a trend towards dominance. And David Clark and others picked this up in the earlier panel. How do we think about the emergence of dominant platforms vis-a-vis the economic ideal of, let's call it even, workable competition? So there are some contexts, video game consoles, for example, Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony remaining viable alternative platforms that have some disciplining effect on each other. In other environments, at best, we seem to see the Facebook replacing the MySpace. Rohit had a very interesting suggestion that buying up potential competition may be part of what aids and abets that dominance. What's your theory of the case? In this world we have over these information platforms develop, will we see rivalry, or do we see successive companies? How do you see it?
Well, it's really hard to compare these verticals. Like the gaming industry, they derive their economic value from the consumer. So you're selling something, a good set of goods. Some of these platforms that we're discussing here do not derive their economic value from the end consumer. They derive it from your advertising inventory, and a whole bunch of other things. And so therefore, you see the gaming industry, you see the mobile phone industry, the Apples and the Androids. I mean, they are just bludgeoning each other. The other thing you see with these industries, those verticals as well, the profit motivation is there. And then you look at these other verticals like Amazon and Netflix and all these other guys, Google, et cetera, where the profit motivation is not as high because the economic value that they get from the capital infused in them is unbelievable. So if you look at the last 5 years, I would argue that the regulators have been kind of asleep at the wheel. When they look at horizontal integration, they spend more time on the Sprint T-Mobile, on the AT&T, Time Warner. They spend a significant amount of time on old school type horizontal integration and nothing on when Facebook bought Instagram or WhatsApp. I mean, zero, right? Even though the valuations are pretty high. And so one can say today, the ship has sailed on that. So now what do? Back to the three constituents, governments are terrified now with these platforms. Businesses, I can tell you, are terrified of these platforms because as soon as Amazon says they're going to go into any vertical, immediately value destruction happens to the incumbents. The only constituent that's not terrified are the end users because they derive so much frictionless service. But there will come a day when the end users will also be terrified, and only then something's going to happen.
Rohit, let me go to you first on this. So to add another example, some people said, well, Amazon buying Whole Foods, we should be terrified about this for reasons that, again, Valen talked to. But from an antitrust perspective, Amazon had no market share in grocery or food distribution. So from a traditional antitrust standpoint, spending zero amount of time or close to that looks to be appropriate. Do you think there's some project that we have to be rethinking some of these antitrust tools to face what in the changed economy, and how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, well, I don't want to comment on any individual deal, but one thing that I'm hoping is that antitrust law is a subset of competition policy. There are many other levers to use outside of the antitrust laws to promote competition, and antitrust law, it's certainly a bedrock of it. But, we've been going through these hearings, and there's a debate about whether the existing tools and approaches and the way the law has developed, does it essentially create too many false positives? And does it lead to under-enforcement? And what is the consequences of that? So I don't think we know the answer. I'm not really sure how to get to that answer unless we actually gather some facts and evidence. One of the things that is important is, it's been mentioned often there's just not the data there. To the extent the government can collect it and can put it out there for people to be able to argue on each side, we need to do that. My sense is that, just serving since May, is that there is likely an under-enforcement problem, and that we are less willing to challenge the close calls because the way the law has developed. I've raised some questions about whether we need to be thinking about other forms of ways to develop the law, including competition rulemaking, and we've heard a lot about that. So things are going to change, I just don't know, but we need to gather facts and evidence to figure out how to surgically do it.
So Grace, a couple of themes there. One is, how can our institutions gather facts and evidence to make policy? And second, how do we think about this trade-off between the false positives versus false negatives? You acted and you're like, ooh, I guess it wasn't the smartest thing to try to stop this merger that now looks like it was irrelevant, or, ooh, I guess we didn't really look at this other issue and we probably should have. How do you think about those two sets of issues?
It's interesting. So I kind of want to run off on a little bit of a tangent, and just posit that under the traditional antitrust analysis, the Amazon Whole Foods example sort of doesn't really raise questions and is according to some, a false, negative maybe, or, a true negative. But if you look at, I think, one of the things that we are concerned about, I think, is just, the amount of power that Amazon just plain has, just because it already gathers, attracts so much, it has such an immense user base, has such a huge, broad reach. And to the extent that I think business models are changing significantly, not just to incorporate your traditional methods of distribution, production, et cetera. It's also turning into very much a data game for all businesses all the way around. It's not just about sort of what you produced, whether you make software, produce content. It is, what do you know about your buyer? What do you know about your competitors' buyers? What do you know, what do you know about the end users, et cetera? And to that extent, I think that is where I think our uneasiness starts to really, that seems to be where the uneasiness is located. That sense that there is going to be this unused, maybe this latent element that we don't know how to deal with just yet. And I think that is what we're sort of pinpointing in this Whole Foods and Amazon deal. And I think that happens generally across the board when you look at any large company, which becomes a new competitor in a new space, has zero market share, and you question whether or not what they have in the way of assets really will be set straight over into, to create more competition in this market, right, which could be a great thing. The Netflix, Amazon content example that I cited has been a huge boon for consumers. Or whether what they have, this sort of increased amount of data that they've been gathering, will turn into something more, I suppose, ominous and more menacing. And I'm not sure what the answer there is yet, but I think the more we can actually be very, and to go back to Rohit's point about gathering facts and evidence, I think it is about gathering facts and evidence, but it is also about the analysis of what we do with that. So the more we can be more articulate about what it is that causes us uneasiness and gives us pause, and actually we can sort of state what the potential harm and outcomes of that particular harm are, I think the closer we can be to actually figuring out what we do about that.
So Patty, let's go to part two of your story, which is these regulatory institutions develop things like railroad commissions, public utility commissions. What do we learn from that history that might speak to this moment as well?
Well, there is a thing called a captured agency, and that happens, especially maybe in federal land management, the creation of the federal land management agencies to, in some ways or other, have more thoughtful regulatory practices. That didn't work out so well if the local ranchers were the grazing board that controlled that. So there is a way in which the creation of an agency can just turn out to be an empowering for the forces that you had before that. I do want to say, as a humanities person, I have never successfully measured anything in my life. So I am a very fresh presence here. And so I guess I'm thinking how much of this is in the subjectivity zone, because in terms of yes, there was the reckoning, yes, a bunch of agencies and commissions got to exist, yes, they soon lost the trust of the public, or pretty soon lost the trust of the public, even if they were born in the optimism of the public. So that's really complicated, and that's why I write sympathetic columns in the Denver Post about how hard it is to be a federal employee. They bring tears to people's eyes, those columns, because they're so heartfelt. It's really hard to do that, because you are dealing with this incredibly difficult, these are the expectations we have for these agencies, and within seconds of their creation, they can be disillusioning and disappointing to people, and that's something that just always has to be danced with. I do think it is possible to say that monopoly and oligopoly create wake-up calls to the American people and to their representatives in legislature and in executive branch places. So that's the cheeriest way to say, and I must say the word dominance is harder to define than platform. I mean, if you sent me off for a time in the lobby to define platform, I could come back sooner than I could come back with a clear definition of dominance, which has colorful implications if you think about it too. So there's some really interesting issues about wrestling with that, how much of it has to be blatant and obvious, how much of it is subtle and therefore all the more powerful because it's not wielding of muscle in public ways. I mean, it's a very interesting term in that. Anyway, I do want to just come back to the subjectivity in responding to your question is huge. So, for instance, you're saying at some point, fascinating, and I think probably right, that at some point the end users have to be, not have to be, but will be terrified. So then, this is too fun, I think, well, we need an algorithm for when to be terrified. Because that's very difficult to assess, to just be thinking, well, I'm kind of scared, taking my pulse, not that scared yet, but to find a way in which we could think that through. And what I love about the word algorithm, I did not know 15 or 20 years ago I was going to love the word algorithm, but we have fallen for each other since then, because it is a word in which humanities and engineers and scientists have to be in relationship with each other, because as our speakers have been saying, that's where we were going to be free of human bias, but then in fact that gets into the code. So I'm delighted that we can all be thinking in those terms. I think I'm most struck by how more explicit and productive we could be looking at the past in looking at the forms of regulation and enforcement that do come into play with very dynamic situations, and being as nimble and agile as we can be in saying, this was the intention of the policy we created, this is where that is not proving out. That's where, I mean, what the land managers call adaptive management. You think, well, we'll help that little spotted owl, and then the spotted owl just keeps dying. And you think, we're trying to help you, would you stop dying, for heaven's sake? So to just have that adaptive management, to say, what went wrong there? We had a policy, it had a goal, we didn't get there. That's what I hope we could do, which particularly with the late 19th century, early 20th century, but even more so the environmental laws of the 1960s and 1970s and what they turned out to mean. The difficulty that if you try to say, I know I seem to be going into a different area, but I think it fits here. If you say, oh, the Endangered Species Act, that turned out to have all kinds of frictions and complications we didn't see. Well, could we revise it? No, because we go to the mat on all sides. Oh, don't touch a hair on that, because then we'll have to, other people will just erase it and so on. If we could have a reasoned form of discussing when a regulation got to the goal and when it went somewhere else, which is not, it's probably maybe more the rule than the exception. So the narrative holds that reckonings are good and important innovations come out of that, but those innovations could be subject to much more deliberation once they're in play to say, is that what we wanted?
Let me ask a final question to the panel, then get to the audience, and this picks up where Patty ended. Rohit hit this point about social media platforms and democracy. Balance picked it up as well. One could say the following: the polarization and the Twitterization of discourse is making it harder to have the sort of deliberate reflection that Patty's saying we need to develop adaptive management solutions to these sorts of platforms. Agree or disagree, and comment. Fallon first.
Agree conditionally. I don't think you need measurable and algorithms to determine when someone is terrified. I mean, this is the first time in a long time, I've been coming to this for a while, that we're not talking about net neutrality in this conference. But one can argue there was no measurements there, and people were terrified about net neutrality. The day will come when consumers, today, if you send an email to a friend and you say you're flying to San Francisco on Gmail, pretty soon you'll get notification of flights and weather in San Francisco, right?
Yeah. Right.
If you were having a phone conversation and you said you were traveling to San Francisco and suddenly you see something, you'd be terrified, right? But you're not as terrified yet on email because it's somewhat useful. Yeah, the weather in San Francisco, I was looking for it. But what if that information is used and gave you something else that was a lot more scarier? And that day could happen. So when this thing turns, when consumers decide to turn on these platforms, it will happen very quickly. Now, on the flip side, I would also argue the thing that worries me most as a businessman and a technologist is that these platforms actually is a source of pride for this country. I mean, our innovation and technology in the United States is far superior than the rest of the world. But China is catching up. So we have to be very careful while the ship has sailed that we don't do too much harm to our innovation and technology, where the Baidus and the Alibaba's and the WeChats suddenly starts dominating the internet.
Patty?
Well, these invitations from Phil, this is a term that we don't use much anymore, but they are psychedelic, and they are just really like, good Lord, it never would have come into my mind to think such a thing. But so I had never thought of this so directly. I guess I thought of it in subtle and indirect ways, but there is no golden age when it comes to really civilized, productive, respectful discourse in the United States. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams hated each other so bitterly they didn't speak to each other for 17 years and so on. So to get nostalgic for I'm not sure that there was ever an amplification of that that's quite at the level we have now. But in the 19th century West, terms were very common in use. Absolutely dreadful forms of expression about other human beings were mainstream and conventional and common. And then I'm thinking, and that continued in not just the American West, but the American South for quite a while. And then somewhere around the mid-20th century, some changes occurred where those forms of disrespectful public expression became less celebrated and even became silenced. And that was a kind of a pleasant interlude. But that's what I'm wondering, if that might be, this is the thing I would not have thought of without these conferences, are we first getting a little bit drawn into nostalgia for the days, the 1850s that led to the Civil War? You can really get very sentimental about those days. So maybe cut back on that, but also recognize that that interlude, that was maybe 30 years where we were going to try to speak to each other in polite and respectful ways. And as if we have that figured out, how to conduct ourselves when we are materially present and using our vocal cords to denounce each other and to express scorn and dislike and hatred for each other. So we haven't got that down for public occasions when we're doing very well today. I just want to say everyone looks very good natured today. It's lovely. But many other situations, we're not clear. What is this thing called hate speech? Where does it constrain free expression by the shouted word, not the... So I'm wondering if maybe we should have a different form of periodization of American history where we can see that this was the norm to see other people in scornful ways and to draw really intense us and them boundaries and to condemn the people on the other side. That was a very respected practice in many circles for a really long time. Then we did have this, I don't know if it's 30 or 40 years, 45 years. I'm happy it was sort of my prime time on the planet. That was nice. But why did we think that was permanent? And so I guess I'm saying some of this is about the technology, but it's also just that something that we thought, well, we've turned that corner. This is really, we should have stayed terrified, actually, of the fact that it could resurge, that it could be back. So that is my main thought. And then I did just have a thing I wanted to say about Neville speaking of this simultaneous translation thing. Or way beyond that, just that you have the technology doing what in the American West did not happen for centuries. Every time Indian people and white people met, there was a person, if they were going to do anything significant in the way of trade or negotiation, there would be a person who was the interpreter and the translator, the only person who spoke both languages. And that person was the hinge. Anytime anybody of any ethnic or nationality group met with others, that interpreter was the person. So for me, as a Western American historian, when he was talking about the interpreter and translator, we may not be needing that. And yet, the interpreters and the translators were a mixed group of people. Some of them were very flawed. Sometimes they were the essential moderator at keeping people from violent forms of expression. So I'm getting nostalgic again a little bit, but it's really, and often they were people of mixed heritage, people of two different nationalities in their parentage. So they were interesting figures. So I began to mourn for them and grieve for them an hour and a half ago when they were going to be supplanted by this 5G thing. So let's just...
I'm forgetting what movie it was, where someone goes on this long rant, and then the translator says, he disagrees.
Good point.
And Rohit, you worried a little bit that with you're talking about what AI can do with discrimination. Do you think that the new media institutions of today are changing discourse, making our democracy in a tougher place to actually address the concerns of these institutions? Is that something?
Well,
Sure, but I always err on the side of more speech than less speech. I don't live in a country that doesn't have these things and that doesn't allow these things.
You're not moving to China, in other words.
I mean, speech is important, and there's going to be consequences of it. I think the question is, to what extent does the controller of the public square discourse, to what extent can they put a thumb on the scale?
Yeah, yeah.
So, to what extent can they promote or screen what types of messages get through, and what is the implication of that for, fair democratic system?
Grace knows well. Section 230 says, your platform, anything that's said on your platform, you're not responsible. You don't have to worry about what you curate or take down. That has become under increasing discussion. What would you say? Either Patty has the sort of hope for self-regulatory adaptive management institutions or any governmental oversight. How do we begin to think about this public square notion when the public square is not at all owned by the public, it's owned by private companies?
Right. I think that's a great question, and it's very difficult, I think. So one of the things that I was thinking about when you were asking this question was the fact that, yeah, social media has been great, and everyone says social media is great because it connects us all. It's not. It's annoying. I've learned so much more about people that I don't care about or actually don't want to know. I have seen Twitter is I've seen too much on Twitter, and I think all of you might feel the same way. So you just realize there's this rush of information coming at you, and I think Facebook and Twitter and all of these other places do their best. This is the rudimentary sort of beginning of trying to customize to your preference what they think you want to see, and also the ads, but so if we get to a point where AI actually does get to this, and this is something my husband asked me that, in my role as a policymaker generally, please just to make sure that the killer robots don't come to be. Right, exactly, right. And I have to say, and he's sitting back there laughing at me, I have to say I'm okay with the robots. I am, for one, I'm going to welcome my robot overlords because data is increasingly everything. And I think I mentioned that when I talked a little bit about the companies becoming more and more data companies. Data becomes so much more integral to all of their plans, regardless of regardless of what they actually produce, do, or whatever else they do. And it's also become increasingly important to us as consumers, as social beings, as just it shapes who we are because of the amounts of data that we're now swimming in and can see. I mean, social media is just one of those options, and we are going to need AI in order to be able to make sense of all of this. We are going to need. We're all going to be involved in assisted thinking at some point, and that's I think that's what's in the future. Now, this may be further off than the next 4 years, or 5 years, but I think that. We're already seeing it in the filtering of our results, in the filtering of our social media feeds, and I think it's going to become more prevalent in all ways that we consume information. And the problem is, do we get an AI, as you've pointed out, in the way the algorithms are built, that actually makes us better human beings, or just more who we wanted, or more of what we just want, which isn't necessarily better. And then who gets to decide what better really is, right? So to the extent that, I am very concerned about, putting in place regulations that would stint the amount of data that is permitted to be collected and disseminated. But I am also very worried about a world in which there isn't some sort of clear guideline on how to be better about those kinds of those practices. Because like it or not, I think the amount of data that we experience are just going to increase. And whether, to go back to the Section 230 question, whether the public square keeper, the Facebooks, whether they are in the best position really to be the best gatekeepers, or whether we as individuals ought to be better gatekeepers, or if there's some other sort of structure that needs to be put into place I'm not sure what the right answer there is, but we are at the very beginning of this, and it's good that we're thinking about this and talking about this now. And hopefully, collectively, with this incredible brain trust that Phil has accumulated over these years, somebody will be able to figure it out.
Speaking of ideas for students to write papers on, we can look back now at spam, which was an early internet policy challenge. People don't generally complain about how Google and Gmail have addressed spam because it's not the challenge that it once was. Whether and if at all the canned spam law played any constructive role in that is certainly open to debate. And so it's interesting case study. Look forward to someone taking it on. Speaking of students, we'd like to hear from you and give you the first question or two. Not afraid to call on people either. All right, we have a ringer here. All right.
Hi, I'm Nagendra. I'm in the interdisciplinary telecom program here at CU. My question here would be pointing out to Commissioner Chopra. That was an amazing keynote. I really enjoyed every topic you have spoken about and what you have discussed, and especially the bias in the algorithms, which is not easy to detect, and it's definitely something we have to address. And one more thing you have pointed out is how we'll be able to preserve democracy in the technology space or even the applications whichever is being developed. So in that aspect, oftentimes from what I have seen, I think it's more often we are reactive in the sense that once the technology is in place, it's being used by people, and then we see some issue with it, and then we react to it and come up with policies. And I understand that it's not easy to be proactive in that aspect because it's not easy to assume how the technology will evolve over time. Based on your experience, I'm just curious to know how do you think the policies will evolve over time to understand if there is a new technology coming up, what might be the impacts of it, or how we should be able to handle it better just based on the experience.
I mean, impossible question to answer. So, I mean, here's what I would say. And I'll just give an analogy from a different context that I'm deeply familiar with. So, innovation in financial products and capital markets had hugely consequential effects on society. It decided who was going to be able to get investment dollars, who was going to get a mortgage, and what price they were going to pay. So naturally, there's a hesitation to put a stop to something before it starts. But where I take the view is, particularly when you're developing infrastructure for a market to prosper, you want to create the conditions in that infrastructure and the policy landscape so that entry barriers remain low, and that there's very clear rules of the road for everybody. Because I think the challenge you get is when the big players don't feel that they can do cost-benefit analysis when it comes to complying with the law. That's where you get trouble. You get a two-sided system. But developing new protections before new technology comes, or before new diseases come, or before new consumer products come, it's impossible, unfortunately, I think.
All right. Other questions? Let's start in the back with Gideon first, and then we'll move up.
So thank you very much for a fantastic and highly entertaining panel. So two things. I don't know if the world is better, if life is great at the moment or not so great, but I think that the key question is, are there any legal interventions or regulatory interventions that can make it better? Because if not, I mean, we can just spin our wheels for as long as we want. I love those conferences, don't get me wrong, I'm an academic myself, but I don't think that we're making any real progress in terms of providing any basis, and I don't want to go into the measurable, immeasurable debate for doing something. Now, the second point is that the world is changing. I almost feel like, I can hear my parents speak about those teenagers with the long hair now, because our concepts of what, what life should be like are very different from what our kids experience, right, in their own use of technology. And actually, all this trend toward personalization, the usage of big data, to make everything highly personalized. As you guys mentioned, I mean, I'm not saying anything new. And they measure everything all the time, like, our attention, what we like, what we don't like. It is what makes them so successful. And if we continue to kind of think, well, should we do this or do that, at some point, and maybe that point is in the past, it will be irrelevant, I think. Please, thank you.
So, fair question to everyone. Is there a single regulatory or public policy intervention at this point you would recommend?
I have a quick thought on that. And again, I commute into so many different areas. So I would say there is a choice to go the way that matters have gone in the oil and gas world, regulatory world, or you can go the way that it's gone in the water world. And I'm going to overstate and oversimplify, but if you like, in this area, you can get the public, and I take your point that they don't really need an algorithm. There will come a time of saying this is going poorly. Then you could have very heated, very rancorous ballot initiatives. And people could put a lot of money into that, and it could be very prickly and very polarizing and so on. So that's one way to go. That's the oil and gas scenario. The other is to go where the water people went, and this is really my question about, is this even imaginable? Yes, people still sue each other over water. That's why we have so many water lawyers in Colorado. That's still thriving. And a lot of that has been supplanted by negotiation. There's a lot of watershed coalitions, stakeholder meetings. Mark Twain is supposed to have said, he didn't say it, but supposed to have said water is, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. Well, that he didn't say that, and it needs to be revised for our time, which is whiskey is for drinking, that has not changed, and water is for brewing coffee to be served at stakeholder meetings. So that is a route, and I tried to think if this is a situation that is susceptible to that. I don't quite know who you would. A watershed coalition, you can figure out more easily who's involved and who has. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's pretty clear who has a stake. But is there an option to actually cut back on the litigation route and or the top-down administrative regulation or the legislative thing, and say, well, who's got a stake in this, and could we chat with each other and see if, I mean, it's just a thought. I don't know.
No, it's an area that I think is incredibly promising. I've written a little bit on this. You think about something like the LEED building standard, where governments have said we need more of this, and it has catalyzed and supported private sector-led efforts and investment that drives change. And in the internet world, you could take something like advertising around human trafficking. Like, how do we help drive change? It doesn't necessarily require legislation or ballot initiatives, but you can see what I have seen in the water world as well, collaborative problem solving.
Yeah.
And also in the internet world, right? I mean, there were NTIA, for example, holds multi-stakeholder meetings that were fairly successful in early privacy discussions, I think, back in 2009, mainly primarily dealing with online behavioral advertising. You saw IAB put out self-regulating guidelines, which had mixed results, I think. You see that in the cyber world, where you have NIST sort of framework for determining it, for best practices, and et cetera. Again, Professor, we're already in the world of big data, and I think if you stymie the flow of data, you will never get to the point where you actually have algorithms that are accurate and clear enough. And I don't think that any one of us wants that to stop. But I think having the clear dialogue, maintaining the clear dialogue between stakeholders, and continuing to involve, I think, regulators as part of that discussion is one place to start. Again, I think doing anything more drastic, and of course, this is the Republican talking. Doing anything more drastic, I think, threatens to some degree innovation. Although, I want to quote Gail Slater at the State of the Net, who looked at the question of Section 230 liability and Sesta Fosta's passage, and she said, sure, there are trade-offs. You have innovation, investment, et cetera, on one side, and then on the other side, you have dead children. So 97 senators decide that was a pretty easy trade-off to make. And I think when you have situations like that, that you get clearer, I think, that there might be clearer choices. But generally speaking, on a framework basis, I think you want to approach this slowly and cautiously.
I think reactively, sure, but proactively, there shouldn't be any more horizontal or vertical integrations with these. I mean, the thought of Amazon buying Netflix or anything like that, the government should be very clear to say, not really going to happen.
I think something that we haven't talked about enough is that if you talk to a lot of venture capital firms, private equity firms, they have changed the way in which, or slowly over time, are now thinking about allocating capital in ways that, where their top question is, will we be able to sell this
That's
to
right.
one of the incumbents? And that means that the nature of enterprises that get capital are going to be different. You may not get the same allocation of investment to ones who are truly seeking that kind of Schumpeterian disruption. And I
Right.
hope that we always have markets that are promoting that kind
Yeah.
of challenge, rather than saying, I'm going to build a business with the hopes of selling to one of the big guys.
Right.
Gideon, do you have a response you wanted to make on that? So the good news about this panel is we want to stimulate questions, ideas for the whole conference. And the bad news is it does have to end in time for lunch. We are at that time. Again, I would encourage all of our professionals in the audience to talk to students and vice versa. And let me thank our panelists for a great discussion.